Covering 2,000 years of church history in about 30 minutes. So if you excuse me, I'm going to go quickly and give you the bird's eye view. But before I do that, and also one other proviso, this little overview of church history is going to be unfortunately centered almost entirely on events in Europe. And this is not because Christianity is somehow a European religion. In fact, it was not. But there are some very good historical reasons why most of this story is going to center on Europe. So it's not by choice, it's just by historical necessity, as we'll talk about in a second. Before we get to the actual history of the church, I want to address another point. We have a tendency to think of history, particularly ancient history, as something that's off in the distance, something that's kind of hazy and hard to make out of the shadows of time, and so it's almost like it occurred on some other planet, as if it's somehow disconnected from us and from our lives. But in fact, this isn't the case. And let me give you an example, a little thought experiment. An average human life is about 80 years. Lasts about, obviously people live longer, some people live obviously less than that. But on average, a human being will live about 80 years. Average human lifespan. Now, when Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in 30 AD, in the first century, there was someone certainly there living in Jerusalem who was, say, 20 years old at the time. Now, there were thousands and thousands of people living in Jerusalem, so this is statistically certain, right? And that person, being one of the hundreds or possibly thousands of people who saw Jesus, was 20 years old. That person lived to, say, 80. When that person turned 80, someone else in the world was born. That person lived to, say, turn 80. And when that person turned 80, someone else in the world was born. These are, again, statistically, these are certain numbers. This is not me trying to pull some argument out of the hat. In fact, just numerically, this is certain. So when that person turned 80, someone else in the world was born who turned 80. Now, if you count the number of lifespans from Jesus of Nazareth to today, what do you get? You get 25. 25. 25 human lives, 25 human lifespans separate us from Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the Declaration of Independence, 3. 3 human lives. That's not much. Right? 240 years. I saw you doing the math. And so history is not as far back as we think it is. And so that's why studying history isn't about studying some people on some foreign planet or some distant place, but it's part of our own story. And it's quite actually accessible to us, as indeed the history of the church is. So, Christianity, the Catholic Church began in the 1st century. As we've talked about, it was under persecution because, of course, it was born in the Mediterranean, which was at that time part of the Roman Empire. And so it was born under this persecution. Paganism was the state religion. The Romans, of course, didn't like Christianity because it was this upstart religion. It was turning over the old order. It was claiming equality among people, which was something very strange for the Romans. The Jewish people at that time didn't like it either. They existed, of course, in the Middle East, in modern-day Israel, but also in Egypt and other places around the eastern half of the Mediterranean. So, of course, they didn't like it because it made claims about the Messiah and made claims about the Jewish faith, that they had actually missed their own Messiah. So Christianity was under great persecution. But it faced this other challenge. In every era of the church, it's as if the church has to face a different question. Obviously, there are a lot of issues that come through history that the church has to face. But Catholicism generally faces some main theme of an era. And the main theme in this early era is a simple one. What is Christianity? What is the Christian faith? Because we have the Bible, we have, of course, the Old Testament, collection of books, and we have the New Testament, which was assembled for the first time officially in its current form in 393. Right? So the church had existed, Christianity had existed for 350 years before the Council of Hippo, when you have the collection of the Old and New Testament as it exists today. But you had all these books, and they're not strictly speaking, it's not like a catechism. It lays out Christian belief very clearly. And if you've read any of the New Testament or Old Testament, you know that that's the case. I mean, there are certain things you can tell, like there is one God. I mean, that's a pretty clear teaching no matter where you go. But how does that work if Jesus is God, and the Holy Spirit's God, and the Father's God? We talked about this with the Trinity. What does it mean that Jesus redeemed humanity from sin? What does it mean that there had to be a sacrifice to make up for sin? I mean, there are a whole host of different questions. How is Christianity to be continued in the world today, after Jesus is ascended to heaven? So the early era of Christianity had to answer this question. What is Christianity? And you had a lot of rival claimants at that time. You had the Christianity that we know, Catholicism at that time. But you also had a lot of variations, what we call heresies. Heresies are distortions of Christianity that focus on one thing or another, generally some aspect of truth, but brought to the point of corruption. And so Christianity had to navigate that early era and answer the question of what is Christianity. Now, of course, the persecutions didn't last forever. Eventually, in the early 4th century, Constantine the Great became the emperor in the West. The Roman Empire by that point had been split into an eastern side and a western side, and each side had its own emperor, its own Caesar. Or its own emperor, rather. So Constantine had become the emperor in the West, and through a series of events, a victory in battle, he became convinced that, in fact, the Christian God existed. And so he was a kind of Christian by belief. He wasn't baptized until his deathbed, which was not necessarily uncommon at that time. But at the very least, when he took power, he actually made Christianity legal in 313. He signed the Edict of Milan with the emperor in the East. That made Christianity legal, and finally, Christians could come out from hiding. And so they actually flooded the Roman government, and they flooded society, because now they were able to come out of hiding, and it was a much bigger movement than anyone had anticipated. And of course, Constantine himself, if not a believing Christian at that time, he was at the very least favorable towards Christians and liked to surround himself with Christians. And so Christianity became, it seems kind of silly, but it became kind of the popular religion in the Roman Empire. Because of course, if the emperor was favorable towards Christianity and you wanted to make a name for yourself or get anywhere in the empire, well, then you wanted to be part of that religion. So there was an explosion of Christians coming into the church at that time. And here was an era where you saw not only the government no longer persecuting Christianity, as it had in this first period, but the government actually became infested, I mean that in the right way, by Christians. They began to become part of the government. And the question changed from what is Christianity to how can Christianity transform a state? Because once Christianity came out of hiding, they were able to settle the doctrinal questions through a series of councils, major councils, where members of the church from around the known world at that time would gather and would decide these issues. So then the question became, how can Christianity transform a state? And we have what became basically the Holy Roman Empire before that term became vogue. That was a later term, actually after the Roman Empire had fallen. But we have this new kind of empire where you went from paganism to Christianity to the period in, say, the 5th century where all of the Roman emperors were Christian of some sort in the East and in the West. So it was quite a transformation, but it would not last. Because in the 3rd century, beginning around the 3rd century, but really in any meaningful way in the 4th century, you had trouble brewing in the East. If you could think of a world map, I don't have a world map, every year I think, gosh, you know what? Let's bring a map in or some kind of PowerPoint or something. But I don't have a map, but if you can imagine a map, if you are at all familiar with, to the east of Europe, you have what is known as the steppe region. And that spans all across Russia and I think Ukraine. And so it's a flat grassland area. It actually stretches over to around China, actually. And what happened was, out in the region of China, there was this kind of nomadic tribe of warriors, horse-riding warriors, who were causing all kinds of trouble with the Chinese, One of the stories is that they are the reason why the Chinese actually have the Great Wall. In fact, there's some indication that actually very well may be true. But the Chinese had this wall, and they couldn't. This group of horse-riding barbarians couldn't get through the wall, so they started heading to the west because they needed something. They were always plundering. They were always kind of hunting and gathering in a violent kind of way.
Was that Genghis Khan?
No, Genghis Khan's a Mongol. He was later on. Yeah. That's a good guess though, because that is basically the pattern that happened with the Mongols. But he started heading west. And he started running into these other barbarian tribes that were settled in the grasslands. And so they bumped into the Goths, who then started moving west because they couldn't deal with this group. And the Goths bumped into the Alans and the Huns and the Avars, and they just all kind of started moving west. Of course, this group that I'm talking about, this mysterious group, are the Huns. Attila and the Huns, and the Attila came later on. So the Huns hit the Goths, and the Goths hit the Suevi. They're all heading west. And unfortunately for the Romans, the West meant the Roman Empire. Now the Romans, by this point, their empire was vast and stretched out, and so they didn't have the resources or the armies to properly guard their borders. And so these barbarian tribes started to pour over. A bunch of battles in the late 4th century. The Goths actually killed the Eastern emperor in battle. Big thing, of course, for the Romans. And the empire began to crumble. And in fact, eventually the empire did crumble. Historians like to point to the year 476 as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, because that was the final, properly speaking, Roman emperor was taken out of power, although he was himself actually a usurper. But anyway, let's not get academic. But the point is that for the Romans, they wouldn't have considered that like any kind of significant date. For them, the Roman Empire just kind of started slowly disintegrating and crumbling and collapsing, and then finally turned into something very different. And that something that was very different was no longer a connected empire, but it was a series of independent little barbarian kingdoms. Because the barbarians came in, and they had no experience with running a vast empire, and so what they would simply do is the leader of their tribe or their local king would set up a fortress and have his little regional army, and they would have their people who would, their peasants who would do the farming and do all the manual labor, and there was kind of an agreement between the king and the peasants. You do the farming and the hard work, and I'll defend you and give you laws, and etc. And you have feudalism. This is the feudal age. So you have this collapse of what held the empire together, because the empire was no longer existing. You had all of this barbarism. The barbarians were largely at this time illiterate. And so Christians, who by this point were certainly not illiterate and actually were quite well educated, they started to realize, well, we want to get out of the cities, out of the towns that these barbarians are either starting or have kind of infested. And we have to set up our own little fortresses to protect ourselves and to live true Christian virtuous lives. And so this is how monasteries came to be. Monasteries were fortresses of learning and prayer, where the monks would gather together and shut out the outside world. And they would gather books, scrolls, ancient documents, not just Christian, but any kind of ancient document they could find. They would put it in their library so that they could preserve it from the barbarians who, at that time, were hardly in love with learning. And so we have the monastic system. But an interesting thing happened. I said that all of the things connecting these different, the old Roman Empire kind of collapsed, but that's not actually true. There is one thing that kept them all together. And of course, that was the Catholic Church. And oddly enough, the Catholic Church, in a kind of weird, indirect way, has the Roman Emperor Diocletian to thank for it. Now, Diocletian was the one who started the worst of the persecutions against Christianity. He was no fan of Christians nor a hero to them. But when he was in power in the late 3rd century, after a long series of chaos in the Roman Empire, he realized that the Roman Empire was too big to be ruled by just one emperor. So he split it in two parts. He had a Roman emperor in the west, Roman emperor in the east. And then he realized that even within these different sections, the provinces were just too big for one governor. They're just too large. People are riding horseback. You can't control all that land. And so he split these into much smaller bits, much smaller areas of land. And then he would put a leader over each one of those little areas. And because Diocletian was a man of great humility, he named these dioceses after himself, these little groups. And of course, the Catholic Church thought, well, this is a good structure for us, right? We can, instead of having some kind of bishop to go into one of these huge provinces, we'll just go into one of these smaller groups. And so you had bishops move into dioceses, where they would watch over them. And so when the empire collapsed, the diocese didn't collapse. The Catholic Church certainly didn't collapse. And so it maintained this network. And this network actually started to have an effect on the barbarians. And so you have this new question. The church is no longer answering what is Christianity or how can Christianity transform a state. Now we're talking about how can Christianity transform people or transform a culture. And so over time, the barbarians, even though they conquered the old Catholic empire, actually became conquered by the Catholic faith. And the barbarians began to convert until you have someone like Charlemagne in around the 8th and 9th century who converted completely. The Franks had converted well before that. But here was someone who was completely in love with learning, who devoted his palace school entirely over to higher learning, and was part of the creation of the university system. This actually came out of barbarians. These barbarians were civilized by the church, and these barbarians we now call Europeans, because of course the Franks were not originally there living in France. The Franks were Germans, a German tribe off from the east. It's the Gaul. Gaul used to be Gaul, and so that's how Europe came to be in a nutshell, of course. But there was something that was happening at the same time. As Christianity was civilizing all these barbarian tribes, you had something stirring off in the Middle East, and that was Islam. That was in the very beginning of the 7th century. Islam had exploded out of modern-day Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and began to spread. And by 730, this is between a 100-year span from the year 630 to about 730, Islam had spread, its armies had conquered its way throughout all of the Middle East, across the entirety of North Africa, and up and taken Spain. So it had completely destroyed all of the Christian communities from the Middle East, North Africa, and up into Spain. Here is where Christianity, for a long time, becomes a story of Europe. Not because Christianity is a European religion, it wasn't, it was a Middle Eastern religion. And its intellectual head, theological head, was around Northern Africa. That's where you had all the real action. That's where you had, like, Augustine, the great Cyprian, Athanasius, and all these people in Egypt and Northern Africa. And that's where all the real intellectual power was being exercised. But Islam changed all of that, destroyed all of those Christian communities, and made Christianity a European phenomenon. And learning, education, culture was just beginning in Europe. I mean, they were still kind of barbaric. They were still kind of coming out of the barbarian age. It wasn't like Egypt, where you have this long tradition of culture and art and civilization. It was quite something different. One of the things that really annoys me, every once in a while I'll see some claim by some Islamic writer who will say, Islam is a religion for Europeans. Or I'm sorry, they'll say Christianity, rather, is a religion for Europeans. Islam is the religion for everyone else. Well, that's ridiculous, of course. Islam is the reason why for a long time Christianity was relegated to Europe, because of Islam's armies and their habit of conquering or spreading by conquest. So that's why so much of this story is European. Nothing to do with Christianity. It has everything to do with history and specifically the spread of Islam. Now, Christians still continued to travel into the now Muslim Middle East. They would go on pilgrimages frequently. They would go and they would travel by foot or by boat to the holy places in the Holy Land, and they would visit the sites and they would pray. And it was quite something for the Europeans at that time. And for hundreds of years, it was actually fine. They had an arrangement with the Egyptians, the Caliphate, who ran that area at the time. But then the Seljuk Turks, this kind of nomadic Turkish warlike tribe, came. They were also Muslims, but they were quite violent. They conquered eventually the Egyptians, and they took over that region. And then they began to harass, attack, and kill the Christian pilgrims who had come to that region. They also had begun to vandalize the different Christian holy sites. And word reached Rome many times. This was not a single event. This was spread out over decades and decades. And finally, the Pope had heard enough, and Urban II called the First Crusade in the 11th century. There were many crusades. It wasn't just one. And they lasted for several centuries. They started off, I think, quite noble and quite defensible in terms of what is just. It was a defensive move. But things didn't continue that way, unfortunately. So the crusade started off as a defensive mechanism, eventually kind of turned into something a little bit different. And then, of course, the crusades didn't last. But there was something very good that came out of the crusades. And that is that when you had all of these European powers over there in the Middle East, they had to have some means of getting supply. They had to have shipping lanes that headed back to Europe so that they could get new troops and new and food and supplies and armor and weaponry and all of that. And so shipping went both ways. So you had all of these different merchants, not only in Europe, but merchants who had set up in the Middle East. And they were sending back not only things like spices and textiles, but they were sending back books, scrolls, all of the things that either the barbarians had destroyed in Europe or things that had simply decayed in the wet European climate. I mean, you can't keep a scroll from decaying for over 100 years in Europe, but you can keep a scroll for 2,000 years in the dry heat of Egypt, or Palestine, or Syria, or something like that. And so they started sending back all of these scrolls and setting up these trade routes. This is how Venice became so wealthy, and Milan, and Florence. Well, this was from these trade routes that kind of had their creation there in the time of the Crusades. So as these books came back, the Europeans started to kind of read this, and the church was foremost among them, because of course, as we've talked about in the past, learning, reason, art, philosophy, all of these things are central to Catholicism, because they're ways of coming to truth, and God is truth. So in a sense, we can come to God through these things. So Catholics in Europe ate these up, these new books, these or not new books, these new copies of old books, things that had been lost to them for a long time. And very soon, there were advances in architecture, and science, in poetry, in art, and literature, in sculpture, in painting, in all of these different things, until it reached a kind of critical mass in the mid-14th century around the region of Florence, where we have the birth of what we call the Renaissance. That's this recapturing of all this ancient learning, all of this stuff that came through, again, through the Crusades. And of course, for the church, this was great. The church underwrote a lot of that. You know, a lot of the Renaissance art and the things that came out of it were supported by the church because they were wonderful. But of course, as things tend to go, it started to get excessive. And when you have this effort to create beautiful things through art and through architecture, then you start to show off with the beautiful things that you create. And in fact, that's what happens. You have these Renaissance figures who were spending all of their money on creating beautiful things to show off. And of course, once that happens, you start to have the introduction of corruption. And that's, is that a phone? Nice. So you have the introduction of corruption into not only society at that time, but into the church itself. And that's what led in the 16th century to the Protestant Reformation. It was a reaction to corruption that had existed, not only in terms of corruption, monetary corruption, but in some places, some Christian groups, certainly never Rome, but some Christian groups actually began to corrupt their faith. This happened, I'll just give you one example. In Germany, there was a German Dominican named Johannes Tetzel, who was preaching indulgences. We'll cover indulgences at a later time, so I don't want to go into that now. But he was collecting donations for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica, and he had this little saying that he would go around, and he was collecting it. And he would say, when a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Now, this is a complete corruption of the doctrine of purgatory. We're going to talk about that next week. So that is not purgatory. It has no place next to purgatory. But that's the point. I mean, Tetzel was one of Martin Luther's great enemies, one of the motivations for his actions. And so you have there in the early 16th century, you have the Protestant Reformation. It starts with Martin Luther, although there were predecessors to him, but it starts in a real way with Martin Luther and then spreads out into different groups, Calvin. Then you have the English Reformation, and it kind of explodes. And the church, the Christian church in the West, is never one again. After that, it will always be split. As this is happening, you have this kind of weakened Christianity. And while that was happening, you had this other movement going on that was still kind of, still part of the fallout. Fallout sounds negative, but it was part of the result of this new learning, new books, and recovery of ancient scrolls and documents, things like that. You have the beginning of what's called the Enlightenment. What happened here is this another one. What happened here? That's all right. It's just that I think I'm so fascinated by the ringtones. I think we've got like a dog, cricket. Could be worse. But you have in Italy, again, I don't know why this has happened in Italy, but in Italy you have this kind of split. For up until that point, in science, science had been basically Aristotelian science. It was based on philosophy and reason with a dash of observation. But what happened is people started to realize, you know what? Aristotle, it seems that he's wrong about a number of things. Because it seems that he spent a lot of time on the philosophical side, but not a lot of time on the observation side. And what observation he did seems to be inaccurate in some places. And so eventually they came to see that you really need to have observation with reason. You have to have those at the same time. Human reason is very important. But it also has to be tied with observation. So this is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment kind of enshrined human reason, but also observation. And of course, that gave birth to modern science. It's fantastic. It's a wonderful thing. And again, the church was fully supportive of that. But, as tends to be the case, it went to a point of excess. And so, instead of saying, we need human reason and observation to come to truth, it said, you know what, we can only come to truth through reason and observation. And then it actually started to nudge out reason and said, well, we can really only know what we observe. And so this led to the what is modern, what we know as modern day atheism. We can't really know about these kinds of supernatural things. We don't. Have you ever seen a guy rise from the dead? I haven't seen a guy rise from the dead. And so you have these modern day atheistic movements. And then out of that came this backlash against Christianity, because atheism didn't stay in the realm of science. It moved into politics and all of these things. And so you had the French Revolution in the 1700s, where you have this backlash against Christianity, where you have priests and nuns who were executed along with the French royalty and the French nobility. And these revolutions spread throughout Europe. In the 1700s, the church was on the ropes. They were being attacked, buffeted. You had the atheists over here, and this attack from this new science, and then you have over here you've got the attack on the old ways of monarchy. It's just so the church is like a pinball, kind of bouncing through around at that time. But they regained their footing in the 1800s because they started to realize that all of these atheistic systems, atheism itself, communism which came out of it, socialism which came out of it, they have this thing in common, and that is that they deny that human beings ultimately have some kind of dignity. This also is true of their critique of the Industrial Revolution on the other side. They saw this also. Human beings aren't treated as human beings. They're treated as commodities or cogs in this wheel. And so they realized that human beings, for there to be a truly just or Christian society or philosophy or way of living, you have to have this idea of human dignity at the center. Communism, socialism, some of the excesses of the Industrial Revolution didn't have that. For them, a human being only had rights insofar as the state granted them rights. But Catholicism recognized, and they were not alone in this was also part of the Enlightenment, but recognized that in fact human beings have rights just because they're human beings. It's not because some state granted them rights. but it's because they are creations of God. And that's what gives a human being dignity. So this theme was carried throughout the 1800s, and then right into the 20th century. In fact, you could say that it was the main theme of the Catholic Church in the 20th century. How to understand this idea that human beings have dignity, something that's innate to them, and that dignity should be lived out, of course, in political arrangements, but also in economic arrangements, as well as in belief itself. And so this culminated in the idea that human beings should somehow be free not only to live and to work and to exist, but also free in their belief. And all of this was part of this other move, this final question for tonight, because of course history goes on. But this final question for this era, it's no longer what is Christianity or how can Christianity transform a state or a culture or people. It's now, how can Christianity exist in this new world? The church is facing all of these things, this explosion of science, this upturning of the old governments, the ancient regimes, the old orders. It's facing this kind of new science that it has to deal with. It's facing these new forms of art. So how does the church deal with this new world? How do we exist in this modern world? And that was the main question faced by the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. And so they came up with a number of different points. And I think one could argue about what was most significant, but certainly historically I think most significant, was this idea that human beings have not only a freedom to act, and freedom to work, and freedom to live their lives, within the boundaries, of course, of morality and law, but they should have a freedom also to believe as well. You can't compel belief. And so the church endorsed this idea of religious freedom there at the Second Vatican Council. That was not always the case with the church in history, because no one would have considered that to be. That would have been odd. That would have been truly bizarre. But we had that there at the Second Vatican Council. So there is no real end to the story, because, of course, the story continues. This is the situation we are in right now. How to be Christian. We're still trying to work out how to be Christian in this modern world. It seems to me, if you look back and maybe look ahead a little bit, we may circle back a bit to one of our old themes: how do you Christianize culture again? Because we seem to be drifting from that. Maybe Christianize the state as well. But of course, the answer to doing that would be different than the answer back in the 4th century. So that was the history of the church in 30 minutes. Did I make it?
Close to it.
Close to it. Awesome. All right. Yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. I can take, if you have specific historical questions like Galileo or things like that, I can take them now. I don't know if we have a separate objections or common, I don't know if we can catch all. I don't remember if we had a session for that.
We do. We have apologetics
We do.
at the end. Yeah.